to me, it was always sitting down, listening, the one-on-one listening. I would try hard, and I'm not talking about the measurements or the kind of stuff you're talking about, engagement service. I go back to really real personal relationships. I worked hard to build relationships, even with shop stewards. I'd get criticized sometimes by my fellow managers because I was sitting in the cafeteria talking to the shop steward for an hour. I'm like, well, yeah, but that's more or less where we get stuff done.
Welcome to Voice Activated, the podcast dedicated to unlocking the power of employee feedback. I'm Sean Fitzpatrick, founder of TalentMap and your host. In each episode, we'll dive into real-world examples and best practices, as well as some lessons learned from employee surveys, pulse checks, focus groups, 360s, and more. If people are at the heart of your business, you're in the right place. Expect open conversations, practical advice, inspiring stories from companies that are getting it right, and some reflections from those who've hit a few bumps along the way. Tune in, listen up, and let's activate the voice of your employees. Michael VanDervort is a seasoned labor relations strategist and trusted voice of employee experience space. Today, he's a key voice behind LRI Consulting Services, where he leads communication, content, and events focused on building extraordinary workplaces. In this episode, we'll unpack the evolving face of labor relations, from managing tension to activating trust, and explore how listening, communicating, and culture are reshaping the way organizations relate to their people. Michael, welcome to Voice Activated.
Thanks so much for having me today, Sean. How are you?
Very good. Very good. Thank you. You're now a consultant at LRI and a bit of a community builder around labor relations. Just tell us a little bit about your backstory. How'd you end up here? What was your journey?
So that seasoned word in my bio, right? It means I'm an old guy these days, but not everyone is, but I guess I am. I've been doing labor and employee relations work for 30 plus years, 35 years, I guess, is something like that. And I lived in Michigan. I grew up in the auto industry in the 70s and 80s. Like I saw that. Long story short, I wound up, I was going to go to law school. Decided to take like a gap year, I guess they call it now. I took a year off, wound up falling in love with somebody and getting married, and wound up, of all places, working at the United States Postal Service as a letter carrier. At the post office, labor relations was not exactly their forte. It's still not today from everything that I can see. But back then, it was pretty contentious, and it was also the only way you could impact your raise, because they negotiated contracts, right, on a national basis. So I joined the union because it was the only way I could get a say in anything that was going on. And so I became very interested in the labor movement, actually ran in a union campaign, got elected as a union official for a couple of years, and I wound up working there for 6 years. And then when I finally decided to end my 6-year-long gap year, I abandoned the law school plan and went and got a master's degree in labor and industrial relations from Michigan State University. Fell in love with doing it. Tried to move up in the post office. They weren't having any of that, so I left and went into the private sector, and I've been doing this type of work ever since. And it's been amazing because I've learned a bunch of stuff. I got to do things that I never would have thought, and I've thoroughly enjoyed that change of plans way back in the day.
So it sounds like you've been on both sides of the equation as an employee, as a member of a union, but also on the other side in terms of negotiating or working with union leadership from a management perspective.
Yeah. I mean, my experience with the union at the Postal Service fairly limited. Like I said, it was a couple years. I was mostly a board of directors trustee. I did act as a shop steward for a little while, so I wore those shoes. It's been a long, long time. And it wasn't a role that I really saw as a career, but it was a way to impact the workplace, to help advantage yourself and others. And so I think one of the big advantages it gave me is I did sit on that other side of the other side of the table I didn't literally negotiate at the post office, but you wore those shoes, right? And so I never forgot that. Like when I went into HR, I mean, I think it gave me, maybe not unique, because other people have certainly made the same kind of transition, but it gave me a good insight into what people that were coming to me with issues were thinking about and how they felt. I could at least imagine myself in their shoes.
So you've been in the field for a long time. Have you seen a shift? Because I've noticed generally, and maybe it's just, think about the 70s and 80s with the strikes and yeah, you still hear about strikes, but it seems like, from my perspective, that there generally has been a shift to a lot more collaboration, a lot more conciliatory work between the two sides, if you will. Or that could be just me noticing stuff recently in the
Yeah,
newspaper. Have you noticed that?
in some ways, yes, and in other ways, no. And I think a couple of the big notable exceptions in the US, and of course, you mentioned Ottawa, so you're dealing with a whole different kind of universe. Canada is a bit different. It's got provincial laws where the US has a nationwide labor law policy and all these things. We're not really here to talk about Canadian versus US, but it is a little different. And I think Canadians are as a country, I think the citizenry of Canada embraces unions, the idea of unions a little bit more than they do in the US these days. US, the union density rate, the people who belong to a union is under 6% in the United
Wow.
States.
Yeah, yeah,
I don't
it's
know the
lower than
number.
yeah.
A lot of people don't even deal with unions, right? A
Mm.
lot of people don't even do it. And then you've got like Sean Fain, who leads the UAW, and Sean
Yeah.
Bryan, who leads the Teamsters. And they have been sort of like there's part of this new guard that came on. They're not really new, but they assumed
Yeah.
the head positions at those unions, which are still major players, a couple years ago. And Sean Fain, of course, took on the big three, and it was a pretty contentious strike. I mean, and they did some tactics. They had rolling strikes and all
Mhm.
kinds of different things that had never been done before. And frankly, I mean, the auto companies, I mean, they fought, but they buckled. They gave
Mm.
some very lucrative deals. Same thing with Teamsters in the UPS strike in here in the States. UPS Teamsters didn't go on strike, but boy, did the Teamsters leverage. So there's that. Then you have the other side where, like in Starbucks, which is not collective bargaining, but is strictly organizing. Starbucks has almost 637 stores have been unionized in the last 3 years.
Yeah.
At a company like Starbucks, who's very progressive, they also face organizing in Canada,
Mhm.
with the U.S. Steelworkers, or the Steelworkers Union in
Yeah.
Canada, rather. It depends who you are and what sector you're in.
Mhm.
Organizing in the U.S. has been up the last 2 years. It's down versus last year about 19% in first half of 2025. So we're seeing a lot of flux. But at the same time, most employers don't have unions because I think most
Yep.
employers have adopted pro. So it's a little bit of a schism, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not one flavor.
Yeah, and it seems like, yeah, maybe they were a real useful tool for many, many years, but I
Oh, for
think you're right.
sure.
Leaders and managers and organizations have adopted, even without unions, a lot of these as well as government, have mandated a lot of progressive workplace practices that weren't in place. So unions become maybe not as relevant as to their initial mandate, and they might evolve that mandate, but yeah, that might be happening a bit. Yeah.
And I think that's spot on, Sean. The unions had negotiated, they say, oh, say thank you to unions for the 40-hour work week and
Yeah.
and the 2-day weekend, and probably, I'm not going to argue that. They made huge changes and had UAW was one of the is back in the 70s and 80s in Detroit. They had some of the strongest contracts but it almost got too they got almost got too powerful, and it kind
Yeah.
of then when the industry broke, it kind of there's a ripple effect. But I think what's happened is they've got caught in their own trap. They had so many things to work on, going back into the 1930s in the U.S. and Canada, where everything was so bad. To your point, government companies have done better. Like it's a combination of things, and I think that exactly what you said. And now they're caught where they can't deliver as much, like that level of stuff, and so
Yeah, now that value that they used to be able to bring. Yeah.
yeah, their value proposition I mean, they've got those benefits, but they can't create new things, right? So
Mhm.
what we're seeing is like in the Starbucks situation, that's the other thing is that there's some generational changes, especially with Gen Z and millennials, who are worried about different kinds of issues than your dad and my dad or I
Right.
might have been as
Yeah.
as boomers or other older generations. They wanted days off, they wanted high pay, they wanted benefit. Not to say people don't care about that,
Yeah.
those aren't the issues that drive campaigns anymore. It's, the LGBTQ
Yeah.
not lifestyle, but LGBTQ protections in the workplace,
Yeah.
dress codes, social
Yeah.
justice, active,
Yeah.
like all kinds of things that really aren't even directly in the purview of collective bargaining.
Mhm.
And yet but that it's more the search for a voice in the workplace and sort of protections of, that is a lot of it. So
Yeah.
that's a huge change. And if you look at Starbucks, as I said, I think it was 637 stores, but they have yet to get even a single collective bargaining agreement. I mean, they've
Wow.
negotiated
Yeah.
for almost 2 years, and they have no agreement. So even with a major success, probably the most successful union organizing campaign in my lifetime,
Yeah. Yeah.
they don't have a contract. And so without a contract, it's kinda like, what if they really accomplish it? It's a tough uphill battle.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't have much leverage yet until you have something on paper. Yeah.
Right.
I'm going to flip over to LRI Consulting and sort of at LRI Consulting Services. I know you talk a lot about building extraordinary workplaces, and it's not a
We
term
do.
we hear a lot of. You hear great workplaces, but this concept, it'd be interesting to hear what it means to you in practice. In terms of what a extraordinary workplace.
I've been with LRI. Companies that I worked at in the past were clients of LRI. So I was a customer once upon a time, and I know the owner, and we became friends and professional colleagues, and used to do a
Yeah.
lot of presenting together. 2 or 3 years, he hired me to come on board and do this sort of mishmash job that I have these days of community and events and social media and research. But LRI has been around going on, it's almost 50 years. They started out as a labor relations training company and the founder, which is my boss's dad, Don, his name is Don Wilson. Don sold labor relations VHS training videos out of the trunk of his car. We've grown up and started delivering some other things, but our stated, company motto is what you said. We help employers create extraordinary workplaces.
Right.
And by that, we have two primary buckets, I guess, of consulting practice. One is if is having issues with labor unions,
Mhm.
specifically like organizing campaigns are going on, we have people who will go in and help the company and the leaders communicate, in an effective way about what the realities of collective bargaining are, because the employees have a big decision to make about, do they really want a union or not? Do
Mhm.
they understand what it means? Do they understand there's good stuff and there's bad stuff? And that's true for both sides. And our objective is to help employer make sure that their employees understand both sides and can make the best decision for themselves, because it's an individual, secret ballot vote
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
we do a lot of other stuff. Hopefully, if we're working with an employer early enough doing the proactive stuff, you never have to deal with the reactive stuff. But we
Mhm.
we cover the whole gamut from,
Mhm.
how you can train your managers to be effective leaders, how you can recognize and or set up and do training that will help you recognize when you have developing issues, all that kind of stuff, which is, we call that the left the boom. My boss wrote a book called Left the Boom. We call that the left the boom type of
Mhm.
work. And
Mhm.
then if you get to in the US, if you get a petition with the NLRB and you have an election, we also help deal with that. And then if they need, like, if so that say somebody loses an election, we'll go in and help them bargain a contract if they, or that kind of thing. So we do all of that. And then we also have a big practice in leadership, which is built around a concept that Phil wrote a book about, and it's called approachability. And it's how to make your leaders, how to make yourself and your leaders be approachable, because approachability, the fact that you can walk up, speak to someone, they will entertain, they'll listen to you, empathy, trust, and they'll come back, right? There's like a
Mhm.
whole nuanced, set of things. But the basic thing is, if I like you, or I at least trust you, I'm more likely to come and bring an issue to you rather than go, down to the union hall or whatever,
Right.
right?
Right.
And those frontline leaders, those supervisors, and it's, it doesn't have to be a frontline leader. It can be an HR person or whatever. But
Yeah.
if leaders are approachable, that's like one of the best starting points. So we do a lot of training around that to help clients, build that type of culture as well.
And it's interesting because we do a lot of employee feedback, employee surveys, and one of the dimensions on the survey is around senior leadership. And we ask questions, around they create a vision, or they communicate, and so on. And then we have open-ended comments. And one of the most common themes are leaders aren't approachable, not easy to talk to, don't get out in the field. So that's interesting. When you talk about training them to be more approachable, are there elements of approachability that you train, or are there sort of buckets of how they think about it? Like, I've never thought about the training side of approachability in terms of teaching them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't personally do the training, but we
Yeah.
definitely do have there's a whole curriculum. We actually have a 4 workshop, what we
Yeah.
call the Approachable Leadership series. There's 4 classes you can go through, right? And it's the first one is, like, Like an example is there was an accident. I can't think of the name of the ship, but there was a ship. One ship hit another, like in the Middle East or something, a few
Hmm.
years ago. And there's a series of decisions that are made, and it's hierarchy. The captain
Yep.
said, "I'm going to my bed, and don't disturb me." Right, and
Yep.
so the person that was on the con, it was her first time there, so she had very little experience, and she's in one of the busiest shipping lanes in the entire world.
Right.
Something's developing. She doesn't want to call the captain. She doesn't know so like
Yeah.
a series of 10-second decisions lead to literally a life taking disaster.
Yeah.
And had they just been able to like reach out, felt comfortable reaching out, that whole thing may have. So we use a lot of examples, like there's a lot of leadership theory, but Phil and our trainers do a great job of kind of teach the significance of it. And hopefully put your like I said, put them those folks that are attending in the shoes. Like, oh my God, if I could prevent something like that with my employee, or
Yeah, it
my.
seems innocuous maybe at the time, but then if as these decisions pile up quickly on top of each other, it
Yeah.
could, yeah, as you
And of
mentioned,
course, most
yeah,
workplace decisions, can I have the day off? Do we
yeah,
have to, that kind of thing. They're not nearly as momentous, but
yeah,
it has, over time, it has that kind of significance, right? So
exactly.
it's what people feel and think, and how do they trust you, or how do that they think they feel about you? You
Mm,
know, people. Phil has a thing called the hero.
right,
And it's like, the basic theory is the hero assumption, sorry. Nobody wakes up and goes to work saying, I'm gonna go in and mess up the company today. All
yeah,
right. Everybody, mostly goes to work with, hoping to have a good day. But bosses, if they don't believe that, or if they don't make the hero assumption, if they make, oh, Sean's got some attitude on him today,
yeah,
or,
yeah,
I mean, so there's like this, it sounds simple, but it's really profound
yeah.
if it's applied effectively.
Yeah, coming in with the right mindset can really change a lot of things that happen during the day. So looking at your background, you've worked in both, unionized, non-unionized environments. It'd be interesting to, from your perspective, how does a listening culture, like around tapping into employees' ideas, insights, suggestions, ways to improve the work, like to create an extraordinary workplace. How do you think they differ across those two cultures, the unionized versus non-unionized environment?
Yeah, union facilities, which is where I started, a UAW plant in Lansing, Michigan, and then I went to a non-union plant, and then I went back in the union, and in and out several times. Unionized companies do not necessarily have bad labor relations. Unions and companies don't necessarily have to hate each other. I've worked at
Right.
places where the relationship was super contentious, and no matter what we did, we could not change the culture. It just
Yeah.
was not changeable, right? I mean, and that's a horrible disaster for everybody. It was a serious failure, and the company eventually wound up going out of business after many efforts to, try to change things. I've also worked in a union plant, a factory where we had 2,000 employees, and we went an entire year without a single grievance being filed
Wow.
in a unionized company, and that's doing something. But that's because we solved issues. We didn't create problems. We weren't politicking. We weren't trying to,
Mhm.
we were trying to get to the root cause of stuff, and so we were able to sit down and talk through things. We had a lot of heavy discussions, but we were able to fix things. So the real world is somewhere in between. I think from the management side, the thing that bugs me about unionized facilities is I hear this not so much these days, but I used to hear this all the time. Well, it's easier to manage in a unionized company because everything's in the book. Everybody treat everybody the same. And I'm like, yeah, well, when you first of all, that's not true. Exactly. There's
Right.
some elements of truth to it, but it's not written in stone. And secondly, if you just do like the bare minimum, you're never going to make anything, so it kind of breeds like mediocrity in my
Right.
mind, right? So
Right.
I believe that going back to whether you're unionized or not unionized, the leadership, how you treat your people, trust, fairness, empathy. I mean, those words, they sound like I'm just repeating them over and over again, but they're such key factors that, but it's harder in a union. The other thing is the union as whether you want to call it third party, the lack of a direct relationship in a one-on-one relationship makes it a little more complicated
Yes.
because there's additional agendas and there's formalized structures, grievances, arbitrations,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. And anytime you layer that on, it makes the system in my mind less of now. People who have a union contract and arbitration, they may love it, and if that's what they want, they pay dues, they get it, right? I'm just saying, to me, it makes it harder to solve problems because you get like more agendas, and they've got to think about how it plays to a whole audience. Anyway,
Yeah.
it's harder, in my opinion.
Yeah, we've worked with both American and Canadian clients with unions. And one of the things that we've done, and maybe you've seen something like this, is prior to running organizational wide surveys, which include the unions and union
Yeah,
members and non unions, is we'll often meet with the leadership team of the unions, the union leadership, talk about the survey, give them a chance to have understanding of why we're doing it, how it fits in. And because what we found is sometimes if you don't do that, they might become suspicious or what's going on, or are
yeah.
you undermining us? So we found that that was one method, and then we found once we got them involved, they got an understanding well in advance of when the final questionnaire is designed and launched and all that sort of stuff. It really helped them. At least they didn't block the process or communicate to the membership to say, hey, you shouldn't be doing a survey, ignore any emails that come through or any correspondence that comes through. We found that was very useful, but there might be other ways that you've seen to engage leaders so they can, support, or maybe you've seen cases where, it wasn't done right. So they really sort of, cut it
Mm,
off and
s-
enabled, didn't enable any feedback.
So in the early days when I did most of my labor relations work in the US, a lot of companies just opted out of doing surveys if there was a union, because
Mm,
for the reasons that you said, right?
yeah.
They were concerned that it would create like negotiations issues. If it's an issue, it's still an issue. We just
Yeah.
aren't
Yeah.
going
It's
to
not going
know
to go
about it.
away.
It's not going to go away.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we address it, right? So I think it comes back to communication. What you said, I think, is spot on. If you want to, like, first of all, you should be finding out what your folks want, one
Sure.
way or
Yep.
another, right? And if you want to rely on the union to bring you that, and you want to measure grievances, and base all your issues on what caused reactive hotspot, and problems in the workplace, I mean, you can do that. And I've worked at companies that did it, and if they survived, and
Hmm.
things got done. But to me, it was always sitting down, listening, the one-on-one listening. I would try hard, and I'm not talking about the measurements or the kind of stuff you're talking about, engagement service. I go back to really real personal relationships. I worked hard to build relationships even with shop stewards. I'd get criticized sometimes by my fellow managers because I was sitting in the cafeteria talking to the shop steward for an hour. I'm like, well,
Hmm.
yeah, but that's more or less where we get stuff done.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, so what if I'm drinking coffee with them? Like I
Yeah.
didn't get it, right? You
Yeah.
go where the people are, you go where the solutions are. I wasn't giving stuff away. I was just working. We were working together, and it's
Yeah.
collaborative, and it worked. So why not do it? But some people didn't like the appearance or whatever, and I always kind of was like, yeah, and not to sound arrogant, I don't mean it that way, but I never understood that psychology. It wasn't us versus them; it was us, and we were trying to make it better for everybody, I
For
thought.
everyone. Have you ever seen surveys used as a tool to flush out whether unionized are coming, or there's a potential for, or a way to mitigate that?
Most companies that are doing proactive stuff are doing, they do I mean, it may still be the whatever you want to call it, the once a year annual
Yeah,
survey, which, kind of is a snapshot in time. And a lot of
yeah.
companies have gone to pulse surveys, and
Surveys.
there's like
Yep,
other ways that are more real time. And of
yep,
course, you're able with AI development and all that. So there's like a whole industry around that. Obviously, you guys are part of it.
yep.
So, and that's effective. I think a combination of things are the last big project I did before I switched over to LRI at 3 years ago. I was involved in a number of these at the last company I worked at. I won't name the name, but we'd been on the great place that the Fortune 100 great
Yep,
place to work list every year since its inception. So like literally, we were a great place to work, or you could say we were an extraordinary workplace, right?
yep.
But even there, we had hotspots, right?
Mhm.
Not every manager's great. Not every group of employees is
Sure.
happy. Not every location is super effective. And I went into one environment, warehouse environment, for pharmacy, and the managers were frustrated. They had worked really hard to try to change things. They had used surveys. They had made changes based on what they heard in the surveys, this, that, and the other thing. Well, it turned out, ironically, we did listening. We were doing one-on-ones and group focus
Yep.
meetings and all that kind of stuff. And which is kind of the way you respond to a union campaign. Although this wasn't one, it was just a frustrated group of employees. Um, what the managers found out, or what we found out and shared with the managers, and it caused this tremendous turnaround, was that despite all their efforts, the efforts were like not really what the people wanted, right? So like
Mhm.
they were like, we need more communication. So they put in monitors and, put stuff up, and they'd start out a newsletter, and they were working really hard. Well, nobody read the newsletter. The monitors weren't in places where people could see them,
Yeah.
at the times they needed to see that. Yeah, I mean, there were a number of other things we found, but by drilling down and talking to those people, and we did it through a combination of interviews, like we did like
Yep.
a 20%, in one-on-one interviews with a team of people, and then we administered a survey to the rest. Everybody got the survey basically, so that everyone had a chance to give us input, to your point, with open-ended questions. And it was unbelievable how much we were able to turn it around once we got to the real, to the real root cause.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how, like, if a union campaign comes, you can't really like go in the workplace and question people directly, but you can, if you listen and gather an intake, you can find out, and gives you a chance to fix it. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a very effective way to do business.
Yeah, surveys, they often tell you, maybe what some of the problems might be, maybe where they're a problem, but they don't tell you why they're a problem.
Yeah,
And communication's a really good example.
yeah.
Because there's all kinds of communicate, top down, bottom up, side to side. So one of the best ways is often, you're right, following up either prior or after a survey and asking people either in discussion groups, focus groups, one on one, what did you mean by that? Or tell us more, or talk about
Right.
that.
You could see on the survey that communication was an issue. And like I said, the managers were like, but we're trying to communicate. We've tried all kinds of different things.
Mhm.
And it was only when you start hearing people in a one-on-one meeting, when they say nobody reads that newsletter, they drop a pile there every month, and nobody picks them up because, first of all, there's nothing in there we care about. And secondly, that's not the kind of communication we need. We need our managers to be getting back to us about problems. They never talk to it, right? It's that underlying the hard work, the being available, being approachable, listening, responding. And the other thing we found, however, was there was lack of resources. The
Mhm.
managers had way too much span of, responsibility. They had like 60 to 1 or something. It should be half that. So we actually also beefed up resources of supervisors and stuff, because the organization had been under supported, frankly.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
that helped the managers as well, because now they actually have time to listen, where before they didn't, right? So it was kind of a self-defeating circle, if there is such a thing, as opposed to the normal self-fulfilling or whatever that
Yeah,
is.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. A downward spiral, it's,
Yeah, it
based
was
on a
that
whole
for
bunch
sure.
of.
But we were able to turn it around, which is
Yeah.
really gratifying, and I much appreciate it, I think.
I guess maybe you could tell me a little bit about, so I've heard you say, that listening is really a system, not necessarily a survey. Is that what you mean by that? It's sort of a way of collecting in lots of different ways, or what do you mean by that?
There's walking around, right?
Yep.
Walking around. I mean, there's a story, like, retail store, and manager, they literally, managers, one of the things store managers are supposed to do is walk around and check in with all the departments.
Yep.
And this one particular dude, he followed the same route every day. And almost every morning at some, or whatever his shift was, at some point he'd get interrupted, right? So at some points, I was looking at the store department attitude survey results, and like, I'm making this up, but like, say the dairy department and the bakery were like, that guy hates us, and they had really low engagement scores. The other side, the pharmacy and the whatever, he said hello to them every day. So the perception that the employees had was, he goes over there because he likes produce better. He hates bakery. Well, the real problem was he never completed his circuit. He'd get in
Yeah. Yeah.
whole, and so there were 2 things. One is go through the whole store and
Yeah.
go on a different pattern every day, right?
Mhm.
And that's not a system, but how you, you gotta approach it holistically, right?
Yep.
You also have to know your managers have to be equally, not your subordinate managers have to be equally engaged, right? It doesn't revolve all around one person. The thing that most often kills even good listening and empathy is people don't respond. They listen, but they don't come back and close the loop. Even bad news, at least it's news. Even bad
Yeah.
news is better than
Yeah.
blank space,
Yeah.
or deaf. So yeah, so I think that's the system. And of course, you've got the formal efforts like a survey.
Sure.
You've got your daily, you've got your complaint processes. You've got your HR department. Like, there's a whole bunch of tools.
Mhm.
Some companies have, hotlines, and, for more serious things. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways to collect and intake information, and you got to use them all, but you got to make sure you use them effectively.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. Yeah, you have all these different and different purposes for different means depending on what the message is. You mentioned something really, I think, really powerful there is, you gotta respond, and that's often the Achilles heel around collecting feedback, whether it's through survey or any other way, and either not getting back to people who gave you feedback about what was generally talked about and said without identifying individuals, but also maybe acting on some of it or doing some of this. What do you think stops managers or leaders? Because I know when they start the process that they're fully intent is, oh yeah, we're going to act on this, we're going to do something. Is it they don't understand the feedback? Is it they need to do what you talked about, they need to drill down when they said communication and really understand it? Or is it something else that's holding them back from really delivering?
I think it's approach, your commitment to being that manager, to really do it well, you have to believe it's important. And I'm not sure all managers necessarily know that, or maybe they hear it, but I'm not sure they get it.
Hmm.
Like during COVID, we saw because I worked at the time I worked in what was called a, critical industry, right? It just had to stay open. So we and restaurants had shut down. We were a grocery store. We had massive growth. Like, we people weren't eating out. They weren't, and they were buying, eating, everything was shorthand. All that stuff that we lived through, right? I don't know how much different it was in Canada, but
It's pretty much the same. Yeah, yeah.
and so we had a hiring spree of like 30,000 people in a month because we were trying to fill warehouses. So no,
Yeah.
it's complete chaos. Everybody's afraid of COVID, dying, being sick, whatever. Got all that going on, which is almost unprecedented. But you also got like 30,000 new people. Got to have more managers. All the training systems are broke because you can't bring them into me. So like it
Yeah.
completely magnified things. And the old analogy of it's hard to push something through from one end to the other through a snake.
Yeah.
There was a huge influx of that in during COVID, but what we saw even 2 or 3 years later was managers, they just got overwhelmed. They had so many audits and all these things. They'd be like, "Yes, Sean, I get it. There's a broken thing, whatever, right? I got it. And then they just get distracted and forget about it, and it
Mhm.
stayed broken. And those things pile up and pile up and pile up.
Mhm.
And I think forget the magnified COVID experience. I think there's a certain element of leadership doesn't get the appropriate training, doesn't have the management skill set, but gets promoted because they're a good operator. I mean, there's a
Mhm.
number of things here that factor in, but the company, any company, has to kind of make sure that the tools and selection processes are available to get the right people in the right seats. That's how we say it here at LRI. We want
Yeah.
the right
Yeah.
people in the right seats. And I know that's cliched a bit, but it's hard
It's
to do that.
important.
It's
Yeah.
easy to say, hard to do.
It is
So,
very hard to do.
and it's easy for me to sit here and pontificate about it, but the companies that do it well are way better off for all kinds of reasons than the ones who don't believe the effort is worth it.
Yeah, that's true. It's a very good point, and it's a real challenge. But yeah, the experience was very much the same here, and it sounds like what you're saying. A big part of the problem is a whole range of variables contributed, but if there's too much on the mid level manager's plate, because that's often okay. We've got our survey results. Now the next level here, you guys work with your teams and do
Put
something.
together a plan.
Yeah, put together an action plan. And you're right, if they're overwhelmed, they have too wide a span of control, too many things, it becomes a sort of a feeling like, okay, it's just hopeless. Why bother? Because I fixed one thing, three other things have been added to the pile. I'm never gonna get any sense of satisfaction by finishing things off because I just feel like it's just a never-ending, pile that I'm working through as a manager. So that's
And then
interesting.
and then and then the other parts of that is like what's tolerated? Like what's the expectation? Does a upper level manager accept that as the norm? So
Mm,
there's a whole it's hierarchical and then,
yeah.
kind of flat across the system, but a lot of it is what's acceptable and what's allowed in the workplace. Because if the manager doesn't have time and the higher level managers don't care or their level they can't get resources even though they've asked, they're like it's not easy to leverage solutions in some of these situations,
Yeah.
but the costs of failing to do so often are way higher than if you'd have just taken the steps in the first place.
And done it, yeah, and some of those costs are long term, or you may not see them for a while. You might, "Oh, nothing
Right.
happened." Well, yeah, but they're incest they're just there, and they happen up over time. One thing we've learned over the years is to when we're doing employee feedback surveys, listening tools, is to start with the lead. If it's a org-wide survey, start with the executive team and make sure that they're involved every step of the yeah, they're not into wordsmithing the questions. That's not what we're talking about. But they're involved about what do they want to get out of it. And they actually document that because oh yeah, we should do a survey, sure, sign off and go. And they don't really think, well, what do you want to get out of it? Why are you doing this? And then what we find after you come back after the survey and work with the leader, the executive team, that they actually do stuff from the survey, because there's stuff that's at the corporate level, mid-level, bottom frontline level. If they display or provide that behavior, model that behavior, it's much easier, we find, for the next level of oh, that's what's expected because we've seen the senior leaders do it. We find that executive-driven approach to surveys seems to be one of the more powerful approaches. Not a perfect approach, but as opposed to a HR initiative.
I'm waving my hands around and smiling because nothing's perfect.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Never. But
Yeah.
you're right. But we can aspire to do our best, I guess.
Yes, yeah, exactly, exactly. One is just think about, like, a lot of our clients are, 500,000, 2,000 employee organizations. If you were the CEO of one of these companies, and we put you in there tomorrow, what's one of the first things you would change or work on or look for to help your organization, your newly, organization that you're running, listen to its people, whether they're union, non-union? What would you do?
It's a great question. There really is no singular answer. I think it would come for me if I was ever in that seat, and I pray that I never am because I do not really want to be a CEO. It would be the culture, and I use Starbucks, and I don't mean to bash them, but they hired a
Yep,
new CEO last year, and he's
yep,
trying to turn the culture around after super successful company for decades. And it's a struggle, but they're doing it with service and reengaging the customer base at the same time that they have a small percentage, 637 stores unionized. That's like 637 and 9,000, so it's only like 7% or something. It's
yep,
not a huge percentage, but they still have that brewing and they have that distraction.
yep,
I wouldn't try to cave into that, but I would try to fix the 93%, the engagement of the 93%, because that's where your leverage is. You used
mhm,
leverage earlier, not with the union, but, in affecting change in your business. And I would do it, using a lot of the principles that I've talked, listening and,
mhm,
empowering, make sure managers. Now, they did suggest that they're gonna add in, like, another level of store manager or more support, because I think they may face some of the same issues, but they have 15 or 16 people in an average store, and those people are largely complaining because 'cause they're understaffed and overworked. That's one of
mhm.
the big things you hear, in the noise that you get off the internet. Um, maybe they need to address that a little bit too.
Yeah,
And I know they're trying, but I think, again, you gotta kinda look at all the elements, but for me, it would be the leadership, the communication, the trying to resolve the problems, paying attention to what you're hearing. If that's universal, it's just gonna continue to grow.
mhm,
If you could figure out a way to fix it, it might resolve some of the other back end problems that they're
yeah.
dealing with. So that's a hypothetical example without trying to bash Starbucks, but something I keep my eye on quite a bit because it's just so intriguing to me.
Yeah, in terms of well, yeah, and I don't know if you're familiar what's going up here in Canada. The Canada Since you work the US Post, Canada Post has been
Oh,
striking
yeah.
here.
I'm not super familiar with the issues, but yes, I
Yeah,
know it's been an ongoing struggle there for a long time.
yeah, and the corporation itself, it's a crown corp, so it's billions in debt. And the writing's on the wall that, look, so much has changed in terms of parcel delivery and, metal level. They are really, it seems from what I read in the news, I'm not involved in negotiations or ins and outs of it, but it seems like it's almost like the union is not like, the writing on the wall seems, well, it's been on the wall for a while, many years, about what's happening in letter carrying, but it seems like they're ignoring it or not paying attention to it. And I'm confused as to why. Like, and maybe they just realized, well, we know the ship is sinking. We're just going to get as much as we can out of it while it sinks.
No, nobody around to rescue the Titanic, so I guess we have to go down with it, but let's hope we could stay above water for as long as possible.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Organizations are monolithic, companies of that size, and especially like Crown Corp. I think the US Postal Service is kind of similar. They're a private corporation, but
Yep.
they're operated by the federal government. They're not funded by the federal government, but they're empowered, so it's
Yeah. Very,
quite
very
interesting.
similar.
they're not great at it either. So, and having lived there for a while, I can empathize maybe with some of the US or the Canada Post people
Yeah,
that it's
challenge.
just a lot of fun. So
Yeah. One last question. If you wanted our listeners walk away with just, one shift or one mindset or one, practice they could adopt to strengthen employee trust in organizations they lead and are involved in, what would it be?
I think I go back to what I mentioned earlier that my boss calls the hero assumption. Trust your people, know your people, assume the best, right? That doesn't mean everybody's great or everybody's perfect and there's always going to be a few bad apples, but don't manage your business because of the bad apples. Manage to for the folks that are contributing and make sure that they're feeling good and engaged and
Mhm.
happy and appreciated and that they know if they come to you, you may not be able to fix the problem, but at least they're going to get time, attention, and response, right?
Yeah.
Because that kind of commitment, and again, sounds super simple to say it, hard to do, but I think if you practice those kind of things in the long run, you're better off. I mean, there's all sorts of other tools, pay, benefits, et cetera, but that relationship is to me the key.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Voice Activated. If you've heard something that got you thinking, don't keep it to yourself, share it. Talk about it, put it into play. That's how better workplaces get built. When you're ready to move from insight into action, head over to talentmap.com. You'll find tools, resources, and strategies to help you lead better with clarity, empathy, and impact. And make sure to follow or subscribe so you don't miss any more real conversations with leaders who know that some of the best ideas for change don't come from the top, but from those employees closest to the work.